Episode 12, Boko Haram Insurgency, Nigeria, Chad, Niger, Cameroon, 2009-present. Bombings, kidnappings, and terror, a ruthless insurgency that redefined extremism in West Africa. Please, subscribe, like, and share. It helps us reach more people. Thank you. This episode traces the rise of Boko Haram from a marginal religious movement to one of the most violent insurgencies in the world. It is a story of ideology colliding with poverty, of state failure feeding extremism, and of how local government neglect and poverty was hijacked through religious deception and mutated into a regional security nightmare stretching across 4 countries in more than a decade. Origins, identities, and the moment Nigeria lost control. Long before Boko Haram became a global headline, the movement had already embedded itself deep within the social, religious, and economic fractures of northeastern Nigeria. The name by which it would become infamous was never formally chosen by its members. Boko Haram emerged organically from local speech, a label coined by residents who struggled to articulate the ideology of a sect that rejected not only Western education, but the Nigerian state itself. The word Boko in Hausa loosely refers to Western-style education and modernity, often associated with colonial influence, bureaucracy, and secular values. Haram, drawn from Arabic, means forbidden or sinful. Together, the phrase came to signify a simple but unsettling idea. Western education is forbidden. It was a name that reduced a complex ideology into something immediately understandable and deeply threatening to everyday life. The movement's actual name, Jama'atu al-Sunnah Lidawati wal Jihad, people committed to the propagation of the Prophet's teachings and jihad, revealed far more ambition. But it was the street name that stuck, because it described what ordinary Nigerians saw unfolding around them. A group that rejected schools, courts, elections, and the legitimacy of Nigeria as a secular nation. At the heart of this early movement was a man whose influence would outlive his life, Mohammed Yusuf. Mohammed Yusuf, preacher, ideologue, and unintended martyr. Mohammed Yusuf was born in 1970 in Yobe State, a region defined by poverty, weak state presence, and limited educational infrastructure. He came from a modest background and received little formal Western education. Instead, Yusuf was shaped by Islamic schooling, local clerical networks, and a generation of post-Cold War Islamist thought circulating through northern Nigeria in the 1990s. Yusuf was not a battlefield radical. He never trained in Afghanistan or fought abroad. His worldview was constructed locally, from Salafi teachings, political grievances, and resentment toward Nigeria's ruling class. To him, the Nigerian elite represented moral decay, politicians enriched by oil wealth while the Northeast remained forgotten. By the early 2000s, Yusuf had emerged as a magnetic preacher in Maiduguri, speaking fluent Hausa and Kanuri, connecting effortlessly with youth who felt locked out of progress. He lived simply, dressed modestly, and cultivated the image of a righteous man untouched by corruption. His sermons were recorded and distributed on cassette tapes and CDs, spreading far beyond mosques into markets, bus stations, and homes. Yusuf preached that Western education had failed Muslims, producing corruption rather than enlightenment. Democracy, he argued, placed human law above divine law. Nigeria's constitution, courts, and police were therefore illegitimate. Yet, at this stage, Yusuf stopped short of openly calling for mass violence. Instead, he promoted withdrawal. Followers were encouraged to disengage from mainstream society, leave government jobs, avoid state schools, and reject secular authority. Communities formed on the outskirts of towns and in remote areas, including a settlement locals nicknamed Afghanistan. This was not a retreat born of weakness, but one of preparation. Yusuf envisioned a purified society waiting for confrontation with a corrupt state. Recruitment surged among unemployed youth, students who had dropped out of school, and small traders disillusioned with politics. Some local politicians quietly tolerated or courted Yusuf, seeing his influence as electorally useful. This uneasy coexistence allowed the movement to grow largely unchecked. But the tension was inevitable. From friction to fire, the 2009 uprising. By 2008 to 2009, relations between Boko Haram and the Nigerian authorities had collapsed. Low-level confrontations escalated. arguments over motorcycle helmet laws, traffic stops, and police harassment. To Yusuf's followers, these encounters symbolized state oppression. To the authorities, the sect had become openly defiant. Yusuf himself warned in sermons that a reckoning was coming. In July 2009, that prophecy was fulfilled. Boko Haram fighters attacked police stations, prisons, and government buildings across Borno, Yobe, Bauchi, and Kano states. The Nigerian state responded with overwhelming force. Over 5 days, security forces crushed the uprising. Entire neighborhoods were flattened. By most estimates, more than 800 people were killed, the majority of them sect members. Mohammed Yusuf was captured alive. Footage later surfaced showing him sitting calmly in military custody, unarmed and cooperative. Hours later, he was dead. Authorities claimed he was killed while attempting to escape. Witnesses told a different story. The video evidence suggested an extrajudicial execution following interrogation. His corpse, bullet-riddled and bloodied, was displayed publicly. The killing was intended as deterrence. Instead, it became ignition. Yusuf's death transformed Boko Haram from a radical sect into a revenge-driven insurgency. His followers no longer spoke of withdrawal. They spoke of war. It is important to note what Boko Haram was, and was not, under Yusuf. While violent clashes occurred, the group had not yet embraced mass kidnappings, suicide bombings, or systematic slaughter of civilians. Yusuf built the ideology and the network. What followed would eclipse even his most radical warnings. Abubakar Shekau, violence as doctrine. That escalation came under Abubakar Shekau. Born around 1975 in Yobe State, Shekau had studied Islamic theology and served as Yusuf's deputy. But the similarities ended there. Where Yusuf was persuasive and politically aware, Shekau was volatile, absolutist, and deeply intolerant of dissent. After the 2009 crackdown, Shekau disappeared. When he resurfaced in 2010, it was through video messages, angry, defiant declarations of war against the Nigerian state. His vision of jihad was uncompromising. Anyone who opposed Boko Haram, including Muslims, was an apostate deserving death. Under Shekau, Boko Haram embraced extreme violence as identity. Bombings escalated sharply. In 2011, Boko Haram attacked Nigeria's police headquarters in Abuja, followed months later by the United Nations headquarters bombing, which killed 23 people and injured dozens. The message was unmistakable. Boko Haram had moved from local rebellion to international jihadist threat. Markets, churches, mosques, and schools became targets. Women and children were deployed as suicide bombers. Villages were erased. Civilians were enslaved. Defection within the group was punishable by death. Shekau ruled through terror, not only over communities, but over his own fighters. Chibok, terror televised to the world. On the night of April 14, 2014, Boko Haram fighters stormed the government girls' secondary school in Chibok, Borno State. 276 schoolgirls were abducted and taken into the forest. The operation was meticulously staged for propaganda. Shekau released videos mocking the girls' parents, declaring the captive slaves, and framing the kidnapping as divine punishment for Western education. Global outrage followed. #BringBackOurGirls became a rallying cry. Governments pledged help. Celebrities spoke out. Yet years later, dozens of the girls remain missing. Survivors described forced marriages, rape, indoctrination, and years of captivity. Chibok became the conflict's most enduring symbol, not just of Boko Haram's cruelty, but of state failure. Fracture, ISWAP, and jihad turned inward. By 2015, Boko Haram faced unprecedented pressure. Regional forces closed in. Internal dissent grew. Commanders criticized Shekau's indiscriminate violence, particularly the killing of Muslim civilians and the alienation of local communities. The breaking point came when a faction pledged allegiance to the Islamic State, forming ISWAP, Islamic State West Africa Province. ISWAP rejected Shekau's brutality, adopting more strategic targeting and emphasizing control over civilian populations rather than annihilation. Boko Haram splintered. The insurgency now fought a three-way war against the state, against regional forces, and against itself. In 2021, ISWAP fighters cornered Shekau in Sambisa Forest. Rather than surrender, he reportedly detonated an explosive device, killing himself. His death triggered mass defections and permanently weakened the original Boko Haram faction. From local revolt to regional crisis. What began as a localized religious protest against corruption and marginalization was hijacked, first by vengeance, then by criminal economies, and finally by global jihadist ambition. Boko Haram's evolution forced Nigeria, Chad, Niger, and Cameroon into a fragile security alliance, drawing in foreign powers and transforming the Lake Chad Basin into one of Africa's most complex conflict zones. This is not only a story of terror, it is a warning about how ideology, neglect, and state violence can turn a preacher's pulpit into a regional war that outlives its founders. Signature attacks, strategy, and the human cost. As Boko Haram survived its near destruction in 2009, it did not simply rebuild, it adapted. Between 2009 and 2012, the group hardened into an insurgent organization shaped by loss, vengeance, and experimentation. Early attacks were crude but symbolic: drive-by shootings, targeted assassinations of clerics and community leaders, arson attacks on schools, and small-scale bombings in urban centers like Maiduguri. These operations relied on small arms, machetes, and locally assembled explosive devices, reflecting both limited resources and an intimate knowledge of local terrain. The Nigerian state responded aggressively. Sweeping arrests, mass detentions, and extrajudicial killings became routine. Instead of isolating the insurgents, these actions deepened civilian fear and resentment, feeding Boko Haram's narrative that the state was an occupying force rather than a protector. Violence became cyclical, each attack followed by reprisals, each reprisal creating new recruits. By 2011, Boko Haram's strategy shifted decisively toward spectacular violence. The bombing of Nigeria's police force headquarters in Abuja marked a psychological turning point, proving the group could strike at the heart of state power. Later that year, the United Nations headquarters bombing killed 23 people, many of them international staff, signaling Boko Haram's intent to place itself on the global jihadist map. Weaponry grew more sophisticated. The group increasingly used vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices, BIDEs, suicide bombers, and coordinated assault teams. Explosives were often packed into cars, tricycles, or even strapped to the bodies of young men, and, later, women and children. Tactics emphasized shock and mass casualties rather than territorial control. From 2013 to 2015, Boko Haram entered its most lethal phase. Entire villages were attacked at night, surrounded, and systematically destroyed. Fighters arrived on motorcycles or pickup trucks mounted with heavy machine guns, sometimes wearing stolen military uniforms to sow confusion. The assault on Baga, near Lake Chad in early 2015, became one of the deadliest incidents of the conflict. Although exact figures remain contested, hundreds, possibly over 1,000, civilians were killed, and tens of thousands fled across borders into Chad. At the same time, Boko Haram perfected the use of suicide bombings in civilian spaces. Markets, bus stations, mosques, churches, and displacement camps were deliberately chosen for maximum casualties. The deployment of female and child suicide bombers, often coerced or drugged, shocked the world and complicated security responses as communities struggled to identify threats without destroying social trust. Cross-border raids expanded the conflict into Cameroon, Niger, and Chad, turning the Lake Chad Basin into Boko Haram's operational heartland. Fighters exploited porous borders, striking villages and military outposts before retreating into marshlands and islands difficult for conventional forces to access. Looting, cattle rustling, and kidnappings became embedded in the group's war economy. Chibok and the weaponization of fear. The abduction of the Chibok schoolgirls in April 2014 marked a strategic shift as well as a moral nadir. Kidnapping became a weapon, used not only for ransom or forced recruitment, but for global psychological warfare. The girls were leveraged as propaganda, bargaining chips, and ideological trophies. Their captivity drew unprecedented international attention, but also demonstrated Boko Haram's ability to exploit publicity without meaningful consequence. Following Chibok, mass kidnappings multiplied. Entire classrooms, villages, and IDP camps were raided. Boys were conscripted as fighters or porters. Girls were forced into marriage, slavery, or suicide missions. Fear emptied schools across northeastern Nigeria, effectively achieving Boko Haram's ideological aim of crippling Western education. Counting the cost. By the time the insurgency fractured in the mid-2010s, the human cost was staggering. Conservative estimates place the death toll at 30,000 to 40,000 people, though the true number may be higher given underreporting in rural areas. More than 2 million people were displaced, many multiple times, creating vast camps dependent on humanitarian aid. Entire local economies collapsed. Farming and fishing around Lake Chad were devastated. Schools closed for years. Food insecurity soared, contributing to malnutrition and famine-like conditions. A generation grew up amid violence, trauma, and disrupted education. Boko Haram's violence was not random. It followed a grim logic: punish civilians to undermine confidence in the state, terrorize communities into submission, and use indiscriminate brutality to compensate for limited manpower and resources. The result was one of the deadliest insurgencies of the 21st century, not only because of how many were killed, but because of how thoroughly everyday life was dismantled. What emerged from these years was not just a battlefield conflict, but a humanitarian catastrophe, one whose consequences continue to shape Nigeria and its neighbors long after the peak of Boko Haram's power. Factors that enabled the spread. How Boko Haram took root and endured. Boko Haram did not emerge in a vacuum. Its rise was the product of long-standing fractures in governance, environment, security, and legitimacy, particularly in northeastern Nigeria. What began as an angry local movement was able to metastasize into a regional insurgency because the ground beneath it was already unstable. Governance without presence, development abandoned. For decades before Boko Haram fired its first shots, the Nigerian state was largely absent from the northeast in everything but name. Roads crumbled or were never built. Schools were understaffed or non-existent. Clinics lacked medicine. Water systems failed. In Borno, Yobe, and Adamawa states, entire communities lived far from any meaningful state service. Youth unemployment was chronic. Education levels lagged far behind national averages. Young men, cut off from formal labor markets and excluded from political influence, drifted between informal trades, religious study, and survival economies. Into this space stepped Mohammed Yusuf and his followers, offering moral clarity, social belonging, and material assistance, sometimes food, sometimes cash, sometimes simply dignity. Early Boko Haram preaching resonated not because it was radical, but because it explained hardship. Western education was portrayed as a fraud that promised prosperity but delivered corruption and exclusion. Government officials were depicted as thieves who had betrayed Islam and the poor alike. For many listeners, this narrative matched lived reality. The movement's earliest growth depended as much on failed governance as on ideology. Boko Haram exploited grievance before it embraced war. When security becomes the enemy, collapse of legitimacy. If weak governance created fertile soil, state violence watered it. After the 2009 uprising, Nigeria's security response became increasingly brutal. Sweeping arrests replaced targeted intelligence. Entire neighborhoods were cordoned off. Suspects were detained without trial. Families searched morgues for missing sons. Extrajudicial killings, often justified as battlefield deaths, became widely reported. Mohammed Yusuf's killing while in custody became a turning point not just for Boko Haram, but for public perception. For many in the Northeast, it confirmed that the state operated outside its own laws. Trust collapsed. Human rights organizations documented how communities trapped between insurgents and soldiers faced impossible choices: cooperate with the military and risk retaliation from Boko Haram, remain silent and risk accusation by security forces. Some civilians began to provide food, shelter, or information to militants, not always out of support, but out of fear or survival. Each abusive raid, each arbitrary detention produced new grievances. Boko Haram did not need to invent propaganda. The behavior of the security apparatus supplied it. Lake Chad's disappearance. Ecology becomes a weapon. As governance and security failed, the environment itself turned against the region. Lake Chad, once one of Africa's largest freshwater bodies, has shrunk by roughly 90% since the 1960s due to climate change, overuse, and drought. What disappeared with the water were livelihoods. Fishing communities lost income. Farmers lost fertile land. Pastoral routes collapsed. Displaced populations moved across borders in search of work or survival, blurring the lines between Nigeria, Niger, Chad, and Cameroon. These movements strained already fragile communities and created ungoverned spaces ideal for smuggling, recruitment, and armed transit. Boko Haram exploited these ecological fractures. Fighters hid among displaced people. Smuggling routes became weapons supply lines. Scarcity intensified competition, and Boko Haram inserted itself as an armed arbiter, sometimes violently, sometimes strategically, into conflicts over land, grazing, and survival. Environmental collapse did not cause the insurgency, but it magnified every existing vulnerability. Crime as fuel, how war paid for itself. As Boko Haram grew, ideology alone could no longer sustain it. Violence required money. The group developed a criminal war economy. Villages under its control were taxed. Livestock was seized. Fishermen and traders paid protection fees. Kidnapping for ransom became central. Not only high-profile abductions like Chibok, but hundreds of lesser-known cases involving traders, aid workers, and local elites. Ransom payments, often quietly negotiated, flowed in through intermediaries. Arms were purchased on regional black markets, including weapons looted from Libyan stockpiles after the fall of Muammar Gaddafi. Fuel, food, and motorcycles crossed borders daily through routes long used by smugglers. Porous borders and limited regional coordination allowed Boko Haram to survive military pressure. Fighters retreated across borders, regrouped in islands and marshlands, then returned. War became self-financing. From sect to franchise, ideological evolution, and global jihad. Originally inward-looking, Boko Haram's ideology hardened under pressure. After Yusuf's death, Abubakar Shekau pushed the group toward total war against civilians, clerics, aid workers, and even fellow Muslims. By 2015, the Pledge of Allegiance to the Islamic State marked a strategic and ideological transformation. The movement gained access to global propaganda networks, tactical guidance, and brand recognition. Videos improved. Messaging became more coherent. Recruitment expanded beyond local grievances into transnational jihadist narratives. The emergence of ISWAP further professionalized aspects of the insurgency. While Shekau emphasized terror, ISWAP emphasized governance, taxation, and military discipline, avoiding mass casualty attacks against Muslim civilians to build local compliance. External links did not create Boko Haram, but they extended its lifespan, sharpened its methods, and embedded it within a wider ecosystem of global militancy. Following the money, internal and external funding. Evidence from Nigerian authorities, UN panels, and regional intelligence suggests Boko Haram relied primarily on internal funding, taxation, looting, ransoms, but also benefited from external financial flows. These included donations from sympathetic individuals in West Africa and the Sahel, cross-border cash couriers linked to jihadist networks, material support channeled indirectly through IS-linked routes. While no single foreign state bankrolled Boko Haram, the informal financial networks of jihadist movements helped sustain it when internal resources fluctuated. A perfect storm. Boko Haram endured not because of any single factor, but because multiple failures reinforced one another. Weak governance created grievance. Abusive security destroyed legitimacy. Environmental collapse displaced populations. Criminal economies funded violence. Ideology gave it meaning. External networks gave it reach. Together, they formed a perfect storm, one that transformed a local religious sect into one of the deadliest insurgencies in modern African history. Political and regional dynamics, a war shaped by interests, borders, and legitimacy. As Boko Haram expanded beyond villages and forests, the conflict ceased to be only a security problem. It became a political test for Nigeria's federal system, for regional cooperation in the Lake Chad Basin, and for the international community's approach to counterterrorism in fragile states. Nigeria, fighting an insurgency while losing authority. For Abuja, Boko Haram posed a dilemma with no clean solutions. Every administration since 2009 leaned toward a security-first posture, deploying troops, declaring states of emergency, and promising decisive military victory. Yet each escalation carried political costs. The Northeast became both a battlefield and a political liability. Entire local government areas slipped from effective control. Elections were postponed or disrupted as voter rolls collapsed under mass displacement. Millions of citizens fled their homes, eroding the state's claim to represent them at all. In some areas, Boko Haram, not the Nigerian government, decided who could farm, trade, or move. Military operations were often announced as successes, but gains proved fragile. Cleared towns were abandoned once troops withdrew. Civilians returned only to find infrastructure destroyed and services absent. Allegations of corruption within military procurement, soldiers under-equipped despite massive defense budgets, fed public anger and skepticism. International and domestic observers repeatedly criticized Nigeria over civilian protection failures, airstrikes that hit villages, arbitrary arrests, prolonged detentions, and abuses in military-run camps. Each scandal weakened trust. The state fought to defeat Boko Haram while simultaneously struggling to convince its own citizens that it deserved loyalty. In this sense, Boko Haram did not simply kill people. It eroded state legitimacy, exposing the gap between authority on paper and power on the ground. Neighboring states, when borders stopped meaning safety. For years, Boko Haram was treated as Nigeria's problem. That illusion collapsed as fighters crossed borders with ease. By 2014, towns in northern Cameroon were being raided. Nigerian military posts came under attack. Chad faced deadly assaults on Lake Chad Islands and along key trade routes. Refugees poured across borders, overwhelming communities that were already poor and politically marginalized. National interests quickly aligned. None of these states could afford a sanctuary for insurgents on their borders. Boko Haram threatened sovereignty, trade corridors, and regime stability. This convergence led to the revival and expansion of the Multinational Joint Task Force, MNJTF, a regional military coalition involving Nigeria, Chad, Niger, Cameroon, and Benin. At its height, the MNJTF coordinated cross-border offensives, shared intelligence, and helped reclaim territory around Lake Chad between 2015 and 2016. But unity was fragile. Each state fought for its own priorities. Chad's forces, highly effective but overstretched, withdrew at times due to domestic pressures and casualties. Niger and Cameroon faced resource constraints and internal political tensions. Nigeria, the largest contributor, remained wary of foreign troops operating deep within its territory. Over time, coordination gaps reemerged. Political ruptures, such as Niger's later withdrawal from some regional frameworks, further weakened collective action. Boko Haram and ISWAP exploited these seams, slipping between jurisdictions faster than alliances could adapt. The insurgency survived not despite borders, but because of them. International actors, help, hesitation, and contradictions. Beyond the region, global powers viewed Boko Haram through multiple, and sometimes conflicting, lenses. Western governments framed the group as part of the broader global war on terror, particularly after attacks on UN facilities and the Chibok abductions drew international outrage. Military assistance followed, training missions, intelligence sharing, surveillance support, and logistical aid. At the same time, humanitarian agencies confronted one of the world's fastest-growing displacement crises. Food insecurity spread across the Northeast. Schools closed. Aid access was restricted by insecurity and military controls. International donors pushed for civilian protection even as security cooperation deepened. This dual-track approach bred tension. Arms sales and military aid drew criticism when Nigerian forces were implicated in abuses. Some partners reduced or conditioned assistance, citing human rights concerns. Others prioritized stability, fearing that pressure on the military might weaken counterterrorism efforts. Competing agendas: defeat Boko Haram, stabilize the region, protect civilians, avoid state collapse, often pulled in different directions. A conflict bigger than any one state. By the mid-2010s, Boko Haram had forced a strategic reckoning. No single country could defeat it alone. Yet no coalition fully aligned its political will, military strategy, and humanitarian responsibility. The insurgency exploited every contradiction: national rivalries, institutional weaknesses, donor fatigue, and public mistrust. What began as a Nigerian crisis became a regional war shaped as much by politics and interests as by gunfire. And in that space, between borders, agendas, and promises, Boko Haram endured. How counterinsurgency looked and why it struggled. When Boko Haram crossed the line from sect to insurgency, the response it provoked was overwhelmingly military. Governments reached first for the tools they knew best: soldiers, firepower, and territorial offensives. What followed was a long, grinding counterinsurgency campaign that won battles, reclaimed ground, and killed commanders, yet never fully broke the movement. The shape of the war. Counterinsurgency in northeastern Nigeria and the Lake Chad Basin unfolded as a cycle of offensives. Troops pushed into forests and rural strongholds, Sambisa, the Mandara Mountains, the islands of Lake Chad, using conventional infantry assaults backed by artillery and air power. Villages suspected of harboring militants were cleared, roads were retaken, flags were raised. Multinational patrols followed, with Nigerian, Chadian, Nigerian, and Cameroonian units coordinating under the MNJTF framework. Airstrikes became a central feature of the campaign. Fighter jets and attack helicopters targeted camps, convoys, and suspected hideouts. Intelligence, often limited or time-sensitive, drove rapid strikes aimed at eliminating leadership figures before they disappeared again into civilian spaces or inaccessible terrain. Alongside these operations, governments experimented with clear-and-hold strategies and limited stabilization efforts. Civilian Joint Task Forces, CJTF, local militias armed and authorized by the state, were mobilized to help identify fighters and protect neighborhoods. In theory, military gains would be followed by reconstruction, policing, and governance. In practice, this final phase rarely arrived. Victory without permanence. The first and most enduring weakness of the counterinsurgency was its over-reliance on kinetic success. Military offensives pushed Boko Haram out of visible strongholds. Sambisa Forest, once portrayed as the group's impregnable fortress, was declared captured multiple times. Major towns were reclaimed. Maps showed shrinking red zones. Yet once troops withdrew, so did the state. Police forces were thin or absent. Schools remained closed. Healthcare, courts, and local administration barely functioned. Displaced populations returned to ruins and empty promises. Militants, meanwhile, did not need to hold territory to operate. They adapted, splintering into mobile cells, hiding among civilians by day, striking by night. In many areas, Boko Haram didn't have to defeat the military. It only had to outweigh it. Civilian harm and the collapse of trust. If kinetic force failed to stabilize territory, civilian harm undermined legitimacy. Human rights organizations documented patterns that became depressingly familiar. Arbitrary arrests, mass detentions of men and boys, women and children held for months or years without charge, escapees from Boko Haram treated as suspects rather than survivors. Some detention centers became infamous for overcrowding, hunger, and preventable deaths. From the civilian perspective, the lines blurred. Soldiers came with weapons and orders, but often without accountability. Boko Haram came with threats, but sometimes with food, access, or protection, however brutal and conditional. In such an environment, fear did not always favor the state. Communities caught between insurgents and security forces learned that cooperation with either side carried risks. Silence, accommodation, or passive compliance became survival strategies. Intelligence dried up. Counterinsurgency, which depends on local trust, found itself operating blind. An enemy that kept changing shape. Even as militaries refined tactics, the insurgency itself refused to remain static. The split between Shekau's faction and ISWAP fractured the battlefield. Instead of one enemy, governments faced two, with different doctrines, targets, and methods. ISWAP reduced attacks on Muslim civilians, embedding itself near communities and focusing on military targets. Shekau's faction doubled down on indiscriminate terror. Allegiances shifted constantly. Fighters defected, redefected, or surrendered temporarily. Some joined militias, others melted into civilian life. The widespread use of child soldiers and female suicide bombers disrupted profiling and checkpoints, forcing security forces into reactive postures. Conventional armies trained for linear warfare struggled against an adversary that needed no front lines, no supply depots, and no fixed command structure. Regional cooperation, strong on paper, fragile in reality. The MNJTF symbolized the understanding that Boko Haram was a regional threat, but cooperation never fully overcame political reality. Each Lake Chad state faced its own crises: budget shortages, internal rebellions, political instability, coups, and leadership transitions. Logistics were thin. Intelligence sharing was uneven. Command chains crossed borders, but not always interests. Chad's elite forces won praise for effectiveness, but deployments were costly and politically sensitive at home. Nigeria, bearing the brunt of the conflict, remained cautious about sovereignty. Niger and Cameroon struggled with capacity. Over time, shifting alliances and political ruptures, such as Niger's later pullback from regional security frameworks, eroded momentum. Boko Haram and ISWAP exploited these gaps, retreating across borders just ahead of coordinated pressure. Winning battles, losing the war. The counterinsurgency did not fail because it lacked bravery or sacrifice. Tens of thousands of soldiers fought and died. Entire units operated in punishing terrain under constant threat. It failed because military force was asked to do the work of politics, governance, and trust. Without sustained reconstruction, justice, and civilian protection, each tactical victory reset the clock rather than ending the conflict. Boko Haram was weakened, but never resolved. And so the war settled into a brutal equilibrium. The state strong enough to prevent total collapse, the insurgents resilient enough to survive. A conflict no longer defined by triumph, but by endurance. The present picture, a war that has changed shape, not ended. Today, the Boko Haram conflict no longer fits the image that once dominated headlines. A single extremist group rampaging across northeastern Nigeria under one leader and one flag. What exists now is something more complex, and in many ways more dangerous. A fragmented, adaptive insurgent ecosystem that continues to exploit the same weaknesses that gave it life. A fractured battlefield. After the death of Abubakar Shekau in 2021, the insurgency did not collapse. It recomposed itself. ISWAP emerged as the dominant armed actor around Lake Chad. Unlike Shekau's faction, ISWAP operates with calculated restraint towards civilian populations it seeks to control rather than terrorize outright. It taxes farmers and fishermen, regulates movement, and embeds itself near communities, offering conditional protection while punishing defiance. Its primary targets are military convoys, forward operating bases, and supply routes, allowing it to project strength without alienating the population it depends on for intelligence and logistics. Alongside ISWAP are remnants of Shekau's network, scattered cells that retain a capacity for brutality but lack centralized command. These groups rely more heavily on criminal violence, kidnapping, looting, and raids, and often clash with ISWAP over territory, resources, and recruits. The result is an unstable insurgent landscape in which civilians face threats from multiple armed actors, not all of them ideological. Local criminal networks further blur the picture. Cattle rustlers, bandits, smugglers, and extortion gangs operate in the same spaces, sometimes aligning with jihadists, sometimes resisting them, but always feeding on insecurity. Violence no longer has a single author. It has many, a cycle of attacks and successes. Security forces continue to score tactical victories. Camps are overrun. Commanders are killed. Weapons caches are seized. Governments announce gains. Yet attacks persist. Roadside bombs still strike military convoys. Bases are overrun in surprise raids. Civilians are abducted for ransom or conscripted by force. Fishing villages on Lake Chad are attacked for refusing to pay taxes. Each victory is local and temporary, while the underlying conditions remain unchanged. This coexistence of battlefield success and strategic stagnation defines the current phase of the conflict. The humanitarian shadow. The war's most enduring feature is no longer the number of fighters, but the number of civilians caught between them. Millions remain displaced, living in camps or host communities where food insecurity, disease, and trauma are constant. Entire generations of children in Borno, Yobe, and Adamawa have known little formal education. Women who escaped captivity face stigma and abandonment. Former fighters, many recruited as minors, return to communities unsure whether to accept or fear them. The humanitarian crisis has outlived the peak of violence because governance has not returned. Where schools are reopened, teachers are scarce. Where markets function, insecurity chokes trade. Where courts exist on paper, justice rarely arrives in practice. Without credible institutions, the state's presence remains episodic, visible during military operations, absent in daily life. Why a military victory alone will not come. The strategic lesson of the present moment is stark. Firepower can suppress insurgency, but it cannot resolve it. As long as displaced populations lack livelihoods, as long as former fighters have no pathway back into society, as long as abuses go unpunished and civilian harm remains unaddressed, armed groups will find recruits and relevance. Effective reintegration programs, combining psychosocial care, de-radicalization, vocational training, and community reconciliation, remain limited and uneven. Accountability for abuses, whether committed by militants or state forces, is rare. Regional cooperation fluctuates with political winds, leaving security gains vulnerable to reversal. A narrowing window. What exists today is not a stalemate, but a narrowing window. The insurgency is weaker than it once was. Its leaders are fewer. Its territory is contested. Its legitimacy is fragile. But without sustained political commitment to rebuilding trust, restoring services, and coordinating across borders, this weakness may only produce chronic instability, not peace. The Boko Haram conflict has entered its quietest phase in years, not because it is ending, but because it has learned how to endure. And endurance, in long wars, can be as dangerous as expansion. The final question is no longer whether Boko Haram can be defeated militarily, but whether the states it challenged can finally deliver the peace they promised their people. The human cost that numbers cannot hold. When the gunfire fades and the maps are redrawn, what remains of the Boko Haram insurgency is not best measured in territory lost or commanders killed. It is measured in lives permanently altered, often in ways no statistic can fully capture. Across northeastern Nigeria and the Lake Chad Basin, childhood itself has been interrupted. Millions of children grew up without classrooms, without routine, without the certainty that tomorrow would look anything like today. Schools became targets, shelters, or ruins. Some children learned to read in displacement camps. Others learned only how to run when gunshots echoed. Many never returned to education at all, carrying the invisible cost of a war they did not choose. Families were fractured in quieter, more enduring ways. Fathers disappeared into mass graves or unmarked detention centers. Mothers fled with children strapped to their backs, unsure whether husbands left behind were alive or dead. Siblings were separated in the chaos of flight, some taken by insurgents, others lost in camps whose records were never properly kept. For many households, grief became permanent, unresolved, and unacknowledged. Displacement camps, meant to be temporary refuges, became semi-permanent worlds. Life there was shaped by ration lines, curfews, and waiting for food, for news, for permission to return home. Overcrowding and poverty bred despair, while trauma remained untreated. For survivors, the war did not end when they reached safety. It simply changed form. Women carried a particularly heavy burden. Many endured abduction, forced marriage, sexual violence, and years of captivity. Upon escape, they returned not to relief but to suspicion, treated as potential threats, shunned by communities, or left to raise children conceived through violence and isolation. Reintegration proved harder than survival. The Chibok girls remain the most haunting symbol of this suffering, not because their pain was unique, but because it was briefly visible. Their faces forced the world to look. Yet for every Chibok girl whose name became known, there were hundreds of others taken from villages that never reached international headlines. The silence around them is part of the damage. Communities themselves were transformed. Trust eroded. Neighbors wondered who collaborated, who resisted, who survived by staying silent. Traditional authority structures weakened, sometimes replaced by fear or militias. Healing these fractures will take longer than any ceasefire. What began as a localized religious movement spiraled into a conflict that reshaped an entire region's social fabric. It turned markets into minefields, schools into symbols, and ordinary lives into battlegrounds of ideology and neglect. The stakes, even now, are not abstract. They are embodied in children growing up without teachers, in women rebuilding lives without support, in communities deciding whether reconciliation is possible or whether fear has won. The story of Boko Haram is often told as a story of terror and counterterrorism. But at its core, it is a story about people who survived and those who did not. And the future of the Lake Chad region will depend not on how many militants are killed, but on whether those survivors are finally allowed to live in peace. Please subscribe, like, and share. It helps us reach more people.